There was a man skiing in the bay. I followed his progress idly, more than a little impressed by the ease of his performance. When later he came over to my raft, we started a conversation. What are you doing here, and what do you study? Conversation that soon casually led to a student rebellion in Plato and revolution. My mother had been sitting on the beach watching. Do you realize who that was? She asked as I climbed out of the water alongside her. Pierre something or other, I said vaguely. She laughed. That's Pierre Trudeau, the Justice Minister, the black sheep of the Liberal Party. Oh no, not another politician, was all I thought at the time. I wasn't particularly impressed. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Denise, and today we're going to start with Margaret Trudeau's book, Beyond Reason. This is her memoir. Can you see it? That light kind of shines on it. I'm going to take off the dust jacket because it rustles tremendously. And I like dust jackets, but not when I'm trying to read in front of a microphone. So I'm going to set that over there. But Margaret Trudeau's book is super interesting. And just before we get started, just trying to give us an idea of this tiny little volume. It's not thick. It won't take us very long to get through this. I just thought I would read you the summary because it's very promising. The summary says that a secret romance with a handsome statesman 29 years her senior took a beautiful 22-year-old girl from obscurity to fame. In 1971, Margaret Trudeau became the youngest First Lady in the world. The Trudeaus appeared the happiest of loving couples, but not forever after. 6 years, 3 children, and much speculation later, Margaret Trudeau walked out. She had taken the unprecedented step of leaving a reigning head of state. Now Margaret Trudeau reveals her own unique experience of life at the very top. The characters in her book are headline makers, the plot is public knowledge, and hers is truly the inside story. With startling honesty, keen insight, and an outrageous sense of fun, she describes the reality behind the glamorous facade, the facts behind the scandals. Her official role led her on a continuous round of state visits, political campaigns, grand parties for world leaders, and tea parties for their wives. But the red tape and the unrelenting security stultified her free spirits, and by the time she mastered the fine art of protocol, she no longer wanted to live by the rules. With illuminating frankness, she reports the fascinating conversations and hilarious incidents that made it all worthwhile as she encountered the famous and infamous, from the royal family and Jimmy Carter to Fidel Castro and the Rolling Stones. Margaret Trudeau has attracted more publicity and more criticism than any woman in the 70s. The press has watched and reported her every uninhibited move. But behind the gossip and headlines is the private world of a young woman struggling to cope with the pressures of public life, which her conventional background and flower child adolescence did not prepare her for. Throughout, Margaret Trudeau has kept her perspective and above all her sense of humor. Her spontaneity, quick tongue, and love of romance are all part of this intimate and candid self-portrait. I must say that it's very interesting to go from a biography, which is what we were reading when we were reading about Ethel Kennedy, to a memoir. The styles are just so completely different. Obviously, they have to be. But it's sort of refreshing to hear somebody's actual voice come through and for them to tell you what their life was like. And I have to say, I think Margaret's a really good writer. I don't know what I expected, but I didn't expect her to have so much self-deprecation. And I won't make this a long intro or anything like that, but I had seen interviews of her before in which she's sort of defending her stance and her right to have chosen the life that she did and her right as a mother to leave if she wanted to leave. And there were people to watch the kids, and it's not really that big a deal. I wish everyone would stop making it a big deal. And that was my first introduction to her. So I don't think that I expected her to have so much insight and such an ability to sort of like even mock her own decisions and sort of like make fun of herself. It's a really interesting book. I hope you guys will enjoy it as much as I've been enjoying reading it. I also want to say a huge thanks to my sister. Hey, Cassie, how are you? This was her idea. She sent this book to me like a while ago when we were doing the Ethel book, and she said, Ethel, that book is crazy. And I also think you should give a look over to Margaret Trudeau because I think it would be a great addition to the channel. So this was completely her idea. Margaret Trudeau was not even really on my radar. I didn't even know she'd written a book. So if we have anyone to thank for this series, it is my twin sister, Cassie, who, by the way, is coming to town in a couple of weeks for our birthday. And I really want to do a show with her. Maybe we'll do our Friday news roundup together. I think that would be a lot of fun. So I'm not promising that will happen because I don't know what will happen, but I love her to death, and I just think it would be so much fun to do an episode. But again, thank you so much, Cassie, for this idea and for this book. Kudos to you. All right. I debated back and forth if I should read the prologue just because it adds to the length of the episode, and I just didn't really know if it mattered. And I'm going to say that it really doesn't, because she kind of covers the same thing in the first chapter. So we're going to start with chapter 1, entitled Growing Up. My first memory is of my younger sister Betsy's birth, sitting in the drawing room waiting to decide on a name, when I was 4 years old and used to being the baby myself. I cannot truly remember how I felt. My next image is far more revealing. My father came home from a trip. What trip? Where to? The details have gone. And he brought me a pair of blue sunglasses. Gingerly, with infinite care at handling such a precious object, I put them on. I have this vivid memory of astonishment. These are for me. Just for me. All by myself. Amazed that in a family of 5 girls I was going to possess something that was just mine, and that my father had actually thought of buying something specifically for me. I can't have been more than 5, and he was still a politician. There wasn't a lot of money at home, and my mother struggled to keep us smartly dressed and well-fed, but everything was handed down from girl to girl. Being fourth in line meant I very seldom had anything new, and what came my way was often scrub-thin and faintly stained. I was also physically small, my sisters being larger and more robust, so that the clothes that should have fitted hung down loosely over my thin shoulders. That was probably the start of a lifelong obsession with clothes that fit. My next memory comes later, though the concern is the same. I'm going to school, and I'm extremely excited. My 3 elder sisters, Heather, Janet, and Rosalind, attend Rockcliffe Park Public School already, and now, after so much waiting, I'm at last to go with them each morning. In the playground, the teachers line us up and discover that I am, by several inches, the smallest. It's an honor, clearly, being the smallest in the school, and I try to take it as such, but I have misgivings. Is it right to be so small? Injustice figures next in the line of childhood reflections. My memory produces a music lesson with a red-faced teacher wearing bright purple lipstick. She's getting us to produce words to the scales. What do these notes sound out? She asks and sings, da, da, da. The little girl sitting next to me puts up her hand. I love you. The teacher beams. And what about da, 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 da? Trembling with my cleverness, I raise my hand and chant, I do not love you. I was snatched out of my wicker chair and ordered to stand in the corner while the teacher summoned the principal to tell me what a wicked, cruel child I was. I was too upset to explain, too shocked to cry. Until I was 9, my father was a minister of fisheries in Lester B. Pearson's cabinet. A big, energetic man, he worked late into each night, and we didn't see much of him. But his influence, the unmistakable stamp of his authority, was on everything we did. The childhood friends, the fads and passions of my early years, pale into a shadowy insignificance today beside this towering presence. My mother, whom we all adored, was a tall woman with hazel eyes. She was a worrier, but she seldom judged, and she was never vicious. Dad was the eldest son in a family of 5, and the Sinclairs emigrated from Scotland soon after his 2nd birthday. His father, also James, had been a school teacher in Granges, Banffshire, and having struggled and totally failed to make enough of a living to feed 4 children, the 5th was born later, decided to seek his fortune in the colonies. He chose Canada quite simply because his passion was fishing. In Scotland, he had found his freedom to enjoy the sport somewhat limited. The second time he was caught poaching on a nearby private estate, the game warden, who was an old friend, told him regretfully, Jimmy, I hate to do it, but next time I catch you poaching, it's jail for you. That would have meant the certain suspension of a teaching license. That night, Jimmy and my grandmother, and a fellow poacher, took out the big maps and lit the kerosene lamps and made the decision to go where the fish were. Both men knew that one of the greatest salmon rivers in the world runs along the west coast of Canada. They agreed, after considerable hesitation and in total ignorance of every other aspect of Canadian life, that Vancouver was probably just the sort of place for a poor teacher with a passion for fishing to start anew. Every penny of their savings went on the boat crossing, and the first years in Vancouver, then a small fishing port filled up vast with immigrants, were a struggle. They never regretted the move. Vancouver is green and lush, with mountains running down to the water, and the fish were like no fish Jimmy had ever seen. He prospered so excellently with his teaching career, later pioneering new training colleges, that before long he had saved enough to buy a cottage up the coast, built his own smokehouse for the salmon, and indulged a passion that never dimmed. When I was a child, I often sat on the steps of the cottage listening to his stories of the move from Scotland and of great fishing sagas or singing sea shanties with him. When my grandmother, who disapproved of such things, was away from home, he would brew me up a special treacle, from a secret recipe. In a flat pan, he would melt down butter and sugar that turned as hard as stone. His accent remained strongly Scottish until the day he died. My father inherited not just the Scottish inflections, which come back even to this day, particularly when he embarks on one of his more colorful stories, but the dour outlook of a Presbyterian Scot. An excessively strict upbringing had left its mark. There was no question but that he must excel at school, and he did, getting a place at the University of British Columbia and later becoming a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. He met my mother, Kathleen Bernard, daughter of a modest Vancouver railway man, when, like his father, he became a schoolteacher. Kathleen was his brightest mathematics pupil. There were 12 years between them. And very properly, he waited for her to finish school and study as a nurse before proposing. Interesting. That's very interesting. And I think that a story like that would plant seeds in your mind that really rules don't matter just so long as you figure a way around them. And I suppose he didn't do anything illegal. I mean, he did wait for her. But I think having been a teacher myself, I think that to have ever found love in a classroom is just so appalling to the ethics of a teacher that I struggle to comprehend being able to choose a life partner from the children that you are currently teaching. I mean, I'm sure she was in high school or something when he knew her. So it's not like he was teaching 6th grade or something. But even so, I just find that to be I can't wrap my head around the notion that you would look into the school of pupils and find a mate there. That seems strange to me, but I don't know. He didn't do anything illegal, so I'm not trying to point a finger at him. But my father doted on my mother. Any bad behavior towards her on our part brought down the wrath of God on our heads. He never actually beat me, though, until I was 14 and was supposed to be cleaning up after a party. I was being lazy and clearly somewhat insolent, and on being told to hurry up, shouted a careless, "I hate you," in his direction. That was enough. He was out of his chair in a second, chased me all over the house, and when he finally caught me, he spanked me. The one thing you can't do if you're a Scot is hate your family. We did everything as a family. My father called us the brawling Sinclairs, and took pride in the racket and the standing of such a respectably large group, even if we were all girls. My sister Betsy was his favorite, with her blonde hair and her close resemblance to my mother. She was his dream daughter. And he had a joke about how when Betsy grew up, he was going to turn my mother in and marry her. I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill, but you guys, that's pretty weird. Betsy conformed, but retained her wonderfully dry sense of humor. Heather, 7 years older than me, and the eldest, was a redhead with a freckled face and blue eyes and a strong will. She went her own way. Janet, 2 years her junior, was a gawky and awkward child who kept lizards in jars and picked up stray dogs and was only saved from being the continual underdog herself by forming a particularly close bond with my maternal grandmother. Lynn, 15 months my senior, probably had the loneliest of childhoods. Because I was a quick learner and skipped grade 3, she and I found ourselves in the same class. At one time, she became fat, wore glasses, and took refuge in Harlequin romances. It was not to last. Lynn became Miss Simon Fraser University and then Miss Radiology. As for me, I was my father's son, the boy he never had. My sisters were all going to succeed on their own particular ways, but I was the one singled out, the one with the extra spark, the child most like my father. My mother considered me the most selfish of the family, and she was probably right. 5 girls and a domineering father. It made for competition. Between us, we tacitly accepted Betsy's hold on his affection, but that didn't stop the race for favor. Very rarely was I singled out for personal attention, and when it came, it wasn't always the treat I expected it to be. Dad had a grueling life. It was no surprise that a couple of scotches in the evening helped. One night, I must have been 5 or 6, he came home late and sat in his own particular armchair and said, "Margie, come over here and you sit on Daddy's knee." I was overwhelmed. He drew me on his lap. "Margie," he said, "you've got to grow up to be a very good girl because I have a bad heart and I'm going to die soon." I wouldn't go to bed that night. My mother cajoled, bullied, threatened, and finally told me that unless I climbed under the sheets, I would miss an expedition to the King and I, planned for the following evening. I cried myself to sleep. I dreamed my father had been killed in an airplane crash like my friend Lois's father. Next day I walked home from school. Death means I'll never see him again. Never. I brooded. From then on, I kept a close watch on him whenever I saw him doing any sort of physical work. It was a full-time job keeping an eye on him, because he was a compulsive weekend do-it-yourself worker. building fences, moving bricks, digging out holes, re-landscaping the garden, particularly when we moved house after he came out of office in 1957 and we went back to Vancouver. He even painted a magnificent mural of fishes, copied from an encyclopedia around the retainer wall of the pool. More than appropriate, he said, as the Minister of Fisheries. Part of me was proud of this good-looking father with a big voice. The rest of me waited for the heart attack. It never came, although at 68 he underwent major heart surgery. He'll be 70 this year. Dad was keen to turn us into healthy, vigorous children and more than happy to leave culture to later days. The result was a curiously barren childhood. We had no ballet lessons, no serious music, no art. The only music he enjoyed was the bagpipes. Television was out, except for the Ed Sullivan Show on Sunday nights. The dinner table was where we were expected to learn about life and what it means to be a family. But the noise was overpowering as everyone tried to compete for his attention. Only my mother stayed silent. As I grew older, I found the racket quite simply insufferable. For treats, my father took us all out to dinner in a nearby restaurant, and it was then that I would really cringe with embarrassment. It was so unbelievably loud. People stared. Dad was the storyteller, the great orator, and if there were guests, he dominated. It was at these dinners that I developed my hatred of labels. "And this," he would say, pointing to me, "is number 4. "No," I wanted to yell back. "I'm not number 4. I'm Margaret." Culture for me, long into my teens, was rock music. I was 14 when the Beatles hit Canada. Lynn and I would sneak out to the garage and listen to their songs on the car radio. We weren't allowed too much music in the house. "Turn off that din," my father would yell on entering the house, guided by some sixth sense to an almost inaudible, distant tune in the attics. When the Beatles came to Vancouver in person, he relented, and he bought us good seats. I was turning 15, blasé, looking older, or so I thought. But I screamed and yelled and swooned with the best of them. If we lacked culture, we got the open spaces instead. When Jack Diefenbaker brought the Conservatives back into power, my father left politics. He bought a plot in North Vancouver and built the house he'd always dreamed of, down to a dead-end street on the edge of a ravine with a view down the creek. Our first summer there was spent damming the water and building a path to the man-made pool. My sister Lynn christened it. It was one of my father's more extreme comic fiascos. Within weeks, she was quite ill. It was then that he discovered that the creek was one of North Vancouver's main septic tanks. Oh, no. Oh, poor Lynn. Not long after the move, he bought a second house, an old log cabin up Vancouver's most northern mountain, Hollyburn, with no running water or electricity, but deep in the forest surrounded by fir trees, pines, and blueberry bushes. There were mountain lakes all round, and deep snow in winter, which we had to gather in buckets and melt down for water. We named the cabin High Hopes, and every weekend either took the chairlift up the mountain, or, when that was out of order, as it often was, we hiked up, the provisions on our back. It took 2 hours. During the daylight hours, we built, dug, and swam. At night, we played cards, hearts, whist, crazy eights, cribbage, and Monopoly. My father loved Scrabble. My father's son, I played the part. I was a tomboy. I built forts in the woods and had adventures on the lakes. These were happy times. A great converted dormitory for us and our cousins in the attic, an oil stove with a perpetually simmering pot of soup for the children as they came in cold from outdoors. That cabin was the best gift my father ever gave me. Much later, the outdoor life was the very one I tried so hard to recreate for Pierre and the children. Looks in a family of 5 girls were more than just important. They were an obsession. We spent more time in the various bathrooms of the many houses we lived in as children than in any other single room. I can remember my sister's preoccupation as clearly as my own. Heather was too plump. Janet too clumsy, sprouting like a beanpole at the wrong moment with her hair somewhat too frizzy and legs too skinny. Lynn started fat and got fatter. Betsy didn't count so much. She was the baby. I was considered the prettiest, which led to jealousy and misery and fights, even to blows with Lynn. From being so small to start with, I developed a mania for making my own clothes and spent many months in home economics courses at my Hamilton Junior High School learning to sew. I believe now that I felt so determined to get nothing but the best materials and the most beautiful clothes, principally to cover up what I felt inside. Confusion, rivalry, inadequacy, and an unending desire to please. I can never quite reconcile these feelings with my determined views. My sisters claim I used to sneak into their rooms and pinch their nicest sweaters. When I was 16, I was chosen by Delbrook Senior High to represent them at the Teen Fashion Council of the Hudson's Bay Company store in the center of town. One girl from every school in the neighborhood came and spent Saturday morning listening to a model talk about grooming and poise and charm. The afternoons were devoted to helping out in the different departments. The idea was to train potential managers. I loved those days. When I got to university, I spent my first long summer vacation working in the store full time. It was then the manager asked me to switch from sociology into commerce so as to prepare for a future job on the staff. I would, he told me, make an excellent manager. They even offered me a full scholarship. I was flattered, but it never really occurred to me to accept. Leonard Cohen once described me as every guy's great date. He meant the words kindly, but he couldn't have been more misguided. The fact is, I never much enjoyed dating. My mother wouldn't let me start until we reached grade 10, and then, like my sisters and their friends before me, I joined the round of chaperone Saturday night parties, hand-holding after school, intense telephone conversations, and the wearing of special badges and signs of a current steady. From the start, I always seemed to get it wrong, perhaps because I had no brothers. I could never see boys as friends. My trouble was that I didn't like to disappoint anyone, so rather than fight to keep my clothes on in the backseat of someone's car, I preferred to skip casual dates altogether and stick with one boy for as long as possible. I was clearly both a prude and a terrible flirt. Dating, of course, was what my father most disapproved of. Heather had made good by finding and sticking to a boy she later married, Tom Walker. Janet was a late bloomer and never very popular as a teenager. Lynn took refuge in fantasy. Betsy was too young. What boys did brave the house were rewarded by snarls and grunts from my father's deep armchair. Since I was the cutest, I gave most trouble. Dad and I fought. About the boys, about the rock music, which he refused to listen to, and which I said provided the words of my rebellion. Later, about politics, values, and money. I just have to take a side note real quick to just say, are we not loving the way that she writes this story? She is so blunt. It's kind of shocking. I mean, the way she talks about her sisters, oh, that girl was ugly, that girl was fat, that girl was boring, that girl was lame. It's like, whoa, girl. I was the cutest, so of course I had all the boyfriends. But at the same time, that was probably the reality. And we're not used to hearing people be so blunt. I mean, I think you're used to hearing people be that blunt if you listen to me. But on the whole, I think that people generally try to be a little bit more tactful. Not Margaret. Anyway, we go on. I graduated in the summer of 1965. A couple of years ago, I saw that a television series had been made about my generation. Whatever happened to the class of 65? They had a point, treating us like a social phenomenon. We really were the last of the innocents, the end of an era. Middle-class kids who never rebelled, girls who wouldn't have dreamed of wearing jeans to school, whose greatest dream on earth was to become a cheerleader. I was given the choice of going to the University of British Columbia, a traditional conservative university with high academic standards, or of going to a brand new university of Simon Fraser, then barely completed. I, of course, wanted Berkeley in California, but that was out of the question. My father, in his usual inimitable way, helped me make the decision. He announced that if Lynn and I opted for UBC, both universities were some half-hour's drive from my parents' house, then we could make our own way there. But if, on the other hand, we agreed on Simon Fraser, he would buy us a car. The friendly persuasion worked, and we acquired a Volkswagen. Simon Fraser had been built on top of a mountain overlooking Vancouver. The long, curvy road that led up to it added to a sense of isolation and remoteness. It was all concrete and glass, and because Vancouver is a rainy city, it was gray, always gray. My first year was simply an extension of my school days, a continuation of middle-class respectability. I was a good student. I dated a football player. I excelled in sociology, and I won myself a first-class scholarship. The second year, everything changed. My father's case for Simon Fraser began to make sense, but not the way he had imagined. He was dead right. As a university, Simon Fraser was an exciting place to be. The classes were kept very small, and the architect of the place, Arthur Erickson, had had the ingenious idea of modeling his university on a Greek academy with a central mall off which opened the library, the theater, cafeteria, and the lecture rooms. Staff and students were quite literally forced to mix as they moved about campus and to speak and to get to know each other. Student activism in Canada was born my second year, 1966, and that mall provided a natural forum for student meetings and for spreading the word if anything happened. When a teaching assistant was fired at UBC, no one got to know about it for days. At Simon Fraser, there wasn't a person who didn't know about the entire case within minutes. A microphone had been built into the podium in the middle of the mall, all part of Erickson's notions about communication. We made the most of it. One day, we had 3,000 students sitting around that podium. I was studying political science, sociology, and anthropology, and my education took place continuously both inside and outside the classroom. The den of my department was Thomas Bonnemore, a Marxist scholar who influenced me deeply. There were Maoists and liberals, conservatives and Trotskyists amongst us, and we talked and talked and talked. Stuck up on that rain-swept mountain, arguing was a formative way in which to spend a year. It changed me. I started to date Philip, an English teaching assistant who was in Canada to study for his PhD on revolutions. A PhD on revolutions. Interesting. What would one do with that? But then I have a degree in history, and what have I done with that? A gentle, serious man, he dictated that our dates should be spent mainly studying together. A good Saturday night for us was a bottle of wine, classical music on the record player, and talking politics. This was the start of a new rebellion at home. My father, never appreciative of any boyfriend, was downright rude to Philip. Somewhere along the way, he had become antagonistic toward radical Englishmen, and he sensed in Philip, quite wrongly, an agitator. His hair was a bit long, he wore a beard, and he was small. He had had rickets as a baby during the war. And my father, who could perfectly well tolerate a dim football player, couldn't stand a mild revolutionary. It didn't help when Philip and 5 other teaching assistants, all English, supported a boy who had written a silly poem with political overtones and published it in the school paper. He had then been expelled. Philip and his friends circulated a letter of protest, and when they were suspended, all hell broke loose. "Riots at Simon Fraser," read every local headline. We fought, we protested, we had good times. And in the end we lost. There was a purge. The radicals, their contracts not renewed, left. And those who had tenure found life so intolerable, they left of their own accord. My involvement throughout, apart from my personal battles over Philip, was a curious one, that of spectator, but never that of participant. Just as I had always turned away at the last moment from becoming a cheerleader at school, so now I didn't join the students in their sit-ins. Even the Vietnam War, I now believe, was something of an abstraction for me, except when friends became draft dodgers. I, too, was devastated by the napalm bombing and cried when I saw photographs of naked children running screaming down ruined streets. But I couldn't be swayed into becoming an activist. I didn't want to be a sheep among leftists any more than I wanted to be a sheep among conformists. What did happen to me was that I began to question things in a way I never had before, and the form that took made my father yell at me that I was an insolent little girl. We tried a reconciliation scene at Waikiki Beach in Honolulu on a peace-offering family holiday, but that was a total failure. On our return, I packed my bags and moved out. My efforts at lodging and sharing apartments formed the next decisive step in my education. I took as little as possible in the way of allowance from my father and soon found myself installed with the professor, Michael Mulcahy, his wife Lucy, who was a fashion designer, and their 3-year-old daughter. I learned a lot from them. There hadn't been much laughter at home, nor touching or demonstrative love, and certainly no praise. Here I saw how nice it was to be cuddled, but also how healthy it was to have real arguments and not sense the end of the world. For the first time, I saw how people can and should and do fight and survive. Michael and Lucy taught me to listen to music and to look at pictures, and having heard me moan and grumble over my courses, suggested I try some English ones instead. It was through them that I came upon the Romantics, William Blake, Coleridge, and Keats. I got obsessed with the idea of freedom and choices of ways of living, with materialism and greed, with the influence of pop music and revolt. They were good months for me. In the last 2 semesters, Marx was definitely dead. I began to listen to Timothy Leary and Buckminster Fuller, and here were my new gods. As a side note, she says, the summer after I married Pierre, Buckminster Fuller came to lunch. I asked the cook to prepare something especially delicious for my hero. He came in, sat down, refused lunch, saying that he had no time to waste on food, spoke incomprehensibly and without interruption for an hour and a half, and told me that he was painting a tapestry of careful thought, and I was not to interrupt. When he left, I cried. See, that's why I feel like I'm going to like this book, because this girl is scathing. Not that I like scathing for scathing's sake, but I do appreciate someone who's just going to tell it like it is. Like, let's just not sit around and chew the fat and waste time. Like, what happened here? Just tell us. Thank you. The last 2 years were crowded with new emotions. A group of university friends introduced me to pot in a cottage facing the sea, where the gulls screamed at us from above our heads, and where we sat on the beach for hour after hour listening to Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever on our cassette tapes. When it rained, we retreated indoors and watched the spray hitting the window panes and had intense conversations about cabbages and kings. Pop music meant a great deal to me. Janis Joplin and her rasping, pleading voice, the Beatles, who seemed to stand for good, and the Rolling Stones, who stood for bad. Because I was the newest arrival, I cooked the meals. It was easy to get marijuana. We grew it in our gardens in the summertime, or bought the grass that came up cheap and plentiful from Mexico and California. I drunk it all in, the music, the drugs, the life. I jibed only at opium, scared off by Coleridge. And though some of my friends tried LSD, there was no cocaine about. I did try mescaline one day, and I spent 8 hours sitting up in a tree wishing I was a bird. It was in this bewildered, though cheerful cast of mind that I set off for what my father announced was to be our last holiday together as a family. Heather stayed behind because she had married Tom. Janet didn't come because she was in France. The rest of us packed our cases for the island of Maria and Tahiti, and it turned out to be a paradise, wild, tropical, with none of the shoddiness of Honolulu. We stayed at the Club Mediterranean. On Christmas Eve, I met a handsome Frenchman called Yves Lewis, water skiing. He'd been on the island a year and a half, a beautiful, almost godlike man with silvery hair bleached to the color of sunshine, with eyes as green as the water he skied on. He was also a gifted flautist and had a degree in sociology, a yogi with astonishing humility about his own achievements. In the evening he sang his own songs, laments about banality and greed, and danced the Tahitian national dance with such skill and dexterity that even the Tahitians stopped to watch him. Who could have resisted him? I fell in love. But I also received a nasty shock. From my experiences with grass and sex and political activism, I thought I was quite something. Yves made me see I had a long way to go. One hot, lazy afternoon after I'd been water skiing, I stayed out on a raft, resting and gazing at the white beach and the very green palms. And there was a man skiing in the bay. I followed his progress idly, more than a little impressed by the ease of his performance. When later he came over to my raft, we started a conversation. "What are you doing here, and what do you study?" Conversation that soon casually led to a student rebellion in Plato and revolution. My mother had been sitting on the beach watching. "Do you realize who that was?" she asked as I climbed out of the water alongside her. Pierre something or other," I said vaguely. She laughed. "That's Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the Justice Minister, the black sheep of the Liberal Party." Oh no, not another politician, was all I thought at the time. I wasn't particularly impressed. I even stood him up one day. He was shy, almost too shy. And when he asked me politely if I would like to go deep-sea fishing with him and told me to be at the dock at 10, I didn't bother to show up. I went off with Yves instead. I was young and romantic. Pierre struck me as very old and very square. Years later, I discovered that he had been to Maria to read Gibbon's The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire and to decide whether to run for prime minister. That Christmas he decided. In February, he announced his candidacy. I saw Pierre only once again before our first date. That was when my father took us to the Liberal Convention, when Pierre was chosen as party leader. My father was campaign manager for the West, for Turner, another leadership candidate. But after our brief acquaintance with him in Maria, the rest of us rooted for Pierre. His most vocal supporters were young and pretty. They wore identical, very short dresses and became known as the Trudeau girls. Posters of his photograph were on every wall behind every door. That night of his election, he carried the whole stadium with him, and everyone shouting and stamping and calling that he was the best. Just after his speech, I was standing in the basement, waiting for my family to reappear. Suddenly, a great mob started approaching, and I crushed myself against the wall. "Trudeau! Trudeau!" they were shouting. Even then, Pierre and I were naturally drawn to one another. As the mob passed, with Pierre in its center, he seemed to pause and catch my eye. Instantly, he stopped the crowd, broke his way through, kissed me on both cheeks, and was swept on. The reporters came dashing over. "Have you eyes for Trudeau? Are you his girlfriend?" "No, I have eyes for him only as Prime Minister." And it was true. I wasn't to see him again for another 18 months. You guys, don't we just love her bluntness? I mean, I'm not saying that necessarily that would always be the easiest thing to live with, but here we have the story of somebody who seems to have no intention of sugarcoating her story. And I really feel like that bodes well for the interest of the book. It's not a long book, and I think it's not long because she doesn't spend a lot of time covering her tracks or her feelings or her opinions about things. Now, as somebody who also has an acid tongue in their head and probably needs to learn to chill, this can sometimes not be an acid in life. But for the sake of this channel and somebody just clipping along through the story and giving us the goods quickly, I am all about it. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me, and I will see you guys later this week. Bye!